They say the devil doesn't always come with horns and fire. Sometimes he comes with red lipstick and a smile that promises everything you ever wanted. Ruby Lane knew this better than anyone, because she didn't just work for the devil, she became him. In a world where men held all the power, Ruby learned to take it without them ever knowing it was gone. This is the story of a woman who turned survival into an empire and made every man in town believe it was their idea. Ruby Lane wasn't always a name that made men nervous. Once, she was just another girl sold to a brothel before she even understood what that meant. 14 years old, no family, no choice, just a bed in a back room and men who paid by the hour. The other girls cried themselves to sleep. Ruby stayed awake. She watched, she listened, she learned. Because even then, trapped in a place that broke most women, Ruby understood something crucial. Information was worth more than beauty, and patience was deadlier than any gun. She spent 5 years in that brothel, not as a victim, but as a student. Every drunk cowboy who bragged about his cattle, every crooked sheriff who whispered about payoffs, every married banker who came through the back door. Ruby remembered it all. She kept a journal hidden under her mattress, written in a code only she could read. Names, debts, secrets, sins. And when she finally walked out of that brothel at 19, she didn't leave empty-handed. She left with enough leverage to bury half the powerful men in the territory. Her first move was brilliant in its simplicity. She didn't blackmail anyone, not yet. Instead, she opened her own saloon in a town called Redemption. Small at first, quiet, respectable enough that the church ladies didn't complain too loudly. But Ruby wasn't selling whiskey. She was selling discretion. Men came to her place because they knew their secrets were safe. Politicians, outlaws, merchants, killers. They all sat at Ruby's tables, drank Ruby's liquor, and never once realized they were giving her exactly what she needed: control. Within 3 years, Ruby Lane owned the biggest saloon in 3 territories. She didn't inherit it. She didn't marry into it. She took it piece by piece, secret by secret, until every man who mattered owed her something.
Yes, ma'am.
A favor, a silence, a debt. And Ruby never forgot a single one. She dressed like a queen and spoke like a lady, but underneath the silk and charm was a mind sharper than any blade.
You're ruined.
She could ruin a man with a whisper. She could start a war with a rumor. And she did both more than once. But power in the West came with a price, and Ruby paid it every single day. She couldn't trust anyone. Not the women who worked for her. Not the men who claimed to protect her. Not even the lovers who shared her bed. Because Ruby had learned the hardest lesson of all. The moment you let someone in, the moment you show weakness, you're already dead. So she lived behind walls no one could see. She smiled when she wanted to scream. She laughed when she wanted to kill. And no one ever saw her cry. The turning point came on a winter night in 1873. A man named Clayton Voss walked into her saloon. Rich, connected, dangerous.
You think you can outwit me?
He sat down at her private table uninvited and made her an offer. Marry him and he'd make her respectable. Refuse and he'd take everything she'd built. Ruby looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she poured him a drink. He smiled, thinking he'd won. He drank it down in one swallow. And by morning, Clayton Voss was dead. The official story was a heart attack. The real story was poison, slow and untraceable, slipped into his glass by the only woman in the West who knew exactly how much to use. Ruby didn't run. She didn't hide. She attended his funeral in black lace and cried beautifully for the cameras. And when his empire collapsed in the legal chaos that followed, Ruby bought every piece of it for pennies on the dollar. She didn't just survive Clayton Voss, she consumed him. And the entire territory learned a lesson they'd never forget. You don't threaten Ruby Lane. You don't even try. After that, Ruby stopped pretending to play by anyone's rules. She expanded her empire into mining, into railroads, into land. She had judges in her pocket, sheriffs on her payroll, entire towns that ran on her money. Men called her a businesswoman to her face and a witch behind her back. Ruby didn't care. She'd learned long ago that respect and fear were the same thing in the West. and she had both in endless supply. But deep down, in a place she never let anyone see, Ruby was tired. Tired of the masks, tired of the lies, tired of being alone. She started noticing things, small things, strange things. A rose left on her doorstep with no note. A woman in the crowd at Clayton's funeral who watched Ruby with eyes that knew too much. Whispers in saloons about other women. Women who'd survived what should have killed them. Women who didn't follow the rules because the rules were written to destroy them. Ruby collected these whispers the way she collected everything else. Carefully, methodically, without letting anyone know she was paying attention. Because Ruby Lane didn't believe in coincidences. And something was happening. Something she couldn't quite see yet. Then one night, a letter arrived, slipped under her door while she slept. No messenger, no explanation. Just expensive paper, elegant handwriting, and a pressed rose. The letter said, "You were not broken. You were sharpened. You are not alone. And what comes next will require more than survival. It will require sisters." The address was somewhere Ruby had never heard of. A house in the middle of nowhere. No town nearby. No law. No witnesses. Just coordinates and a date 3 weeks away. Ruby read the letter 5 times, burned it, kept the rose, and started making arrangements. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving, didn't explain, didn't make excuses. She just closed her books, gave instructions to her most trusted employees, and prepared to disappear. The people of Redemption watched her pack with confusion and fear. Ruby Lane never left. Ruby Lane was the town. But Ruby didn't owe them explanations. She'd built her empire from nothing. She could walk away from it just as easily. Because the truth was, all that power, all that control, all those men bowing and fearing her name, had never filled the emptiness inside her. It had just decorated it, made it look like success when it was really just survival wearing expensive clothes. The journey took 6 days. Ruby traveled in her finest carriage with a driver she'd paid enough to guarantee his silence. They moved through territories she'd only heard about in stories. Dry land that stretched forever. Mountains that looked like God had gotten angry and broken the earth. Towns so small they were barely worth the name. And everywhere, Ruby felt eyes on her. Not threatening, just curious. Because women like Ruby didn't travel alone, didn't dress like royalty in the middle of dust and desperation, didn't carry themselves like they owned the world, even when the world had proven it belonged to no one. On the 3rd night, they stopped at a trading post, a sad little building that sold overpriced supplies to desperate travelers. The owner, a man with gaps in his teeth and greed in his eyes, tried to charge Ruby triple for a room.
Here's your $5.
She smiled, set down exact change for what the room was actually worth, and looked at him with eyes that had watched better men than him die badly. He took the money, gave her the key, and didn't say another word. Ruby slept that night with her Derringer under her pillow and her door locked, not because she was afraid, but because caution had kept her alive when arrogance had killed smarter women. The 4th day brought rain. Heavy, relentless rain that turned the road into mud and made travel nearly impossible. Her driver wanted to stop, wait it out. Ruby told him to keep moving, because something inside her, some instinct she'd learned to trust more than reason, told her that stopping meant losing momentum. And Ruby Lane had built her entire life on momentum, on moving forward before anyone realized what she was doing, on being 3 steps ahead when everyone else was still trying to understand the first. So they pushed through the rain, the carriage rocking and sliding, until the sky finally cleared and the road became passable again. On the 5th night, Ruby allowed herself to think about what she was doing. Really think about it. She was abandoning an empire, walking away from everything she'd spent 15 years building. For what? A letter from a stranger, a pressed rose, a promise that she wasn't alone. It should have felt insane. It should have felt reckless. But it didn't. It felt like the first honest decision she'd made since she was 14 years old. Because every choice since then had been about survival, about building walls high enough that no one could ever hurt her again. But walls that kept pain out also kept everything else out, and Ruby was tired of living in a fortress of her own making. She thought about the women she'd heard whispered about, The ones who'd survived impossible things. A widow who'd killed the men who murdered her husband. A former nun who'd traded her rosary for a rifle. A dancer who'd brought down an entire corrupt sheriff's department with nothing but information and patience. Ruby had dismissed these stories as myths, legends that grew in the telling. But now, holding that rose between her fingers, she wondered, what if they were real? What if there were other women out there who'd learned the same lesson she had? Women who'd become weapons because the world left them no other choice. What if she wasn't alone after all? The sixth day brought clarity. The land changed. Less desert, more green, trees that suggested water nearby. And finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ruby saw it, the house, exactly where the coordinates had promised. It sat in a small valley surrounded by cottonwoods and wild grass. 2 stories, weathered but solid, smoke rising from the chimney. No other buildings in sight, no town, no neighbors, just the house and the land and the sky. Ruby's driver slowed the horses, looked back at her with questions in his eyes. Ruby didn't answer. She just opened the carriage door and stepped down into the tall grass. She told her driver to wait, gave him enough money to stay at the nearest town for a week, told him if she didn't send word by then, he should go home and forget he ever brought her here. The man looked at the house, looked at Ruby, and for a moment she saw something in his face. Not pity, not fear, but understanding. He'd driven Ruby Lane for 5 years. He'd seen the empire she'd built, the men she'd destroyed, the loneliness she tried to hide. And he understood, maybe better than anyone, that whatever was in that house, Ruby needed it more than she needed anything she was leaving behind. He tipped his hat, turned the carriage, and left her standing alone in the grass. Ruby stood there for a long time, just looking at the house, listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling the weight of the gun on her hip and the rose in her pocket, and the choice she was making. She could turn back, return to redemption, reclaim her empire, live the rest of her life exactly as she had been living it. Safe, powerful, alone. Or she could walk up to that door, knock, and find out if the letter was truth or trap, if the whispers were real or just desperate women telling themselves comforting lies, if there really was something in this world besides survival and loneliness and the endless performance of strength. She chose the door, walked toward it with steady steps, her boots crushing the wild grass, her heart beating harder than it had in years, not from fear, but from something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Dangerous, foolish, beautiful hope. The kind that got women killed in the West. The kind Ruby had trained herself to ignore because hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But here, walking toward a house she'd never seen to meet people she didn't know, Ruby let herself hope. Just a little. Just enough to keep walking. She reached the porch, climbed the 3 wooden steps, stood in front of a door that looked like it had weathered 100 storms and would weather 100 more. And she knocked 3 times, clear and firm. The sound echoed in the quiet evening air. For a moment, nothing happened. Ruby's hand moved instinctively toward her gun. Old habits, old survival instincts. Then she heard footsteps inside. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. The door opened, and Ruby Lane, who had faced down killers and corrupt lawmen and men who thought they owned her, felt her breath catch. Because standing in the doorway was a woman, just a woman. But in her eyes, Ruby saw everything she'd been looking for. Recognition, understanding, and the same loneliness she carried. The woman didn't smile, didn't speak, just looked at Ruby for a long moment, taking her measure, deciding if she was worth the risk. Ruby looked back, didn't flinch, didn't perform, just stood there as herself, not the Devil's Rose. Not the woman who owned half the territory, just Ruby. Finally, the woman stepped aside, gestured into the house. Ruby walked through the door. It closed behind her with a sound like a promise. And for the first time in 15 years, Ruby Lane felt like she'd come home to a place she'd never been. Inside, the house was simple, clean, a table, chairs, a fireplace burning low, no decoration, no softness, but it felt lived in. Safe. The woman gestured to a chair. Ruby sat. The woman poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove, set one in front of Ruby, sat down across from her, and they looked at each other in silence. 2 women who'd survived the unsurvivable, who'd become what they needed to become,
all this time,
who'd lived so long behind masks they'd almost forgotten what their real faces looked
I will
like.
tell you the truth.
The woman spoke first, asked just one question. Why did you come? Ruby
I'm
thought about
listening.
that, about all the
Kept this to
reasons she
myself
could
to
give,
protect you
all the clever
for all
answers,
these years.
all the ways to maintain
But I
control,
can't
even
live
here.
with this lie
But she was
anymore.
tired of control, tired
Kept
of
this to
games,
myself to
so she
protect
told the
you
truth.
for all these
Because I'm
years.
tired of being alone.
But I
The woman across the table nodded
go
slowly,
this way.
like Ruby had just passed some invisible test. She didn't offer her name, didn't ask for Ruby's. They both knew names didn't matter yet. Names were earned here, not given. Instead, the woman stood and showed
your wits
Ruby to
about
a
you.
room upstairs.
Bye.
Small, clean, a bed, a window overlooking the valley, a single chair, nothing else. The woman said one thing before leaving. Rest. You'll need it. Ruby didn't ask what she meant, just nodded, set her bag down, and sat on the edge of the bed as the door closed behind her. She didn't sleep that first night, just sat by the window watching the moon move across the sky, listening to the sounds of the house, creaking wood, settling foundations, and something else. Footsteps, soft, deliberate. Someone else was awake. Someone else couldn't sleep either. Ruby wondered how many women were here, how many had received letters, how many had walked away from
I
their
am
lives
Sarah
for a
from the
chance
Valley.
at something they
I
couldn't
heard you
name.
needed help. Yes, I
She
do.
thought about the empire
Come in.
she'd left behind, the saloon that bore her name,
3 months here.
the
others are
investments that would
coming.
keep
This is the
running without
beginning.
her,
Just-
the men who
I
would wonder where
understand.
she'd
We
gone
need to
and be
ready.
too afraid to
But
ask.
why would they write
Morning
this?
came with the smell
Perhaps
of coffee
the
and
reason
bread.
matters more than the
Ruby
sender.
dressed and went
Why?
downstairs.
Why? Yes.
The woman from the night
Indeed.
before was
Why?
at the stove. She looked up, gestured to the table. Ruby sat. A plate appeared in front of her. Eggs, bread, nothing fancy, but real food made with care. They ate in silence. When they finished, the woman finally spoke, told Ruby her name was Sarah, that she'd been here 3 months, that others would come, that the house was a beginning, not an ending. Ruby asked who sent the letters. Sarah smiled, said she didn't know, said maybe that wasn't the right question. Maybe the right question was why. Why gather women like them? Why this house? Why now? Ruby spent the next few days learning the rhythm of
Looks
the
like
house.
rain later.
Sarah
Don't think
woke before
so. Sun
dawn,
feels too warm.
tended to practical things,
Maybe you're right.
firewood,
Want me
water,
to finish this?
repairs. She moved through the space like she'd lived there for years instead of months. Ruby offered to help.
Yeah.
Sarah didn't refuse. They worked side by side, fixing a broken shutter, clearing brush from around the foundation. Simple work, honest work, the kind Ruby hadn't done since she was young,
Yeah.
and she found something unexpected in it. Peace. Not happiness, not joy, but the quiet satisfaction of building instead of manipulating, creating instead of controlling. They talked sometimes, not about their pasts, not yet, but about small things, the weather, the land, the way the house caught the evening light. Sarah had come from the north, had lost people she loved, had done things she couldn't undo. Ruby heard the story between the words, heard the weight of survival, the cost of becoming hard enough to endure. She recognized it because she carried the same weight.
My dear.
They were different
We were
women from
so
different places
worried.
with different
Thank
sins,
God you're safe.
but they'd both learned the same lesson. The world didn't forgive weakness, so they'd stopped being weak, and now they were here, together, building something neither of them fully understood yet. A week after Ruby arrived, another woman came. Ruby was out behind the house when she heard the horse. She came around front to see Sarah greeting a stranger, younger than both of them. Mexican,
Welcome, sister.
beautiful
You are
in a
safe
way that
here.
would have made her a
We'll take
target
care of
anywhere
you.
else.
Here, drink.
But there was something in her
Thank you
eyes that
both.
killed any thought of her as a victim. Something
Soy
holy
Magdalena.
and terrible at once.
Vengo de la misión
She
dos
carried rosary
territorios
beads
al
in
sur.
one hand and a knife in the other.
Puedo explicarlo.
The contradiction was perfect.
In nomine Patris et Filii
Ruby
Spiritus
watched
Sancti.
Sarah embrace her,
In nomine Patris et
watched the
Filii
younger
Spiritus
woman's
Sancti.
shoulders relax just
Miserere mei
slightly,
domine.
like she'd been holding herself ready for violence and could finally lower her guard. Just a little, just enough. Her name was Magdalena. She'd come from a mission 2 territories south. Ruby didn't ask what had driven her here. Didn't need to. She could see it in the way
Forgive me
Magdalena's hands
and
shook when
guide
she
me
set
toward
down the knife,
light.
in the way she crossed herself before eating, in the way she prayed under her breath like she was trying to bargain her way back to heaven. That night, the 3 of them sat at the table. Sarah cooked. Magdalena helped. Ruby watched. And for the first time in her life, Ruby felt like she was part of something that wasn't built on fear or leverage or control. Just 3 women who'd survived, who'd found each other, who were building something new in the ruins of what they'd been. Magdalena stayed, took the room next to Ruby's, spent her mornings in prayer and her afternoons working harder than any woman Ruby had ever seen. She cleaned. She cooked. She tended to the small garden behind the house, and she never complained, never asked for thanks, just worked like she was trying to earn redemption 1 act of service at a time. Ruby understood that. She'd spent years trying to buy her way to something better. It never worked. But watching Magdalena find peace in the simple act of making bread or mending a fence, Ruby wondered if maybe the younger woman had found something she hadn't, a way to carry the weight without letting it crush you. The 3 of them fell into a rhythm. Sarah handled the structure, the repairs, the practical needs. Magdalena handled the heart, the food, the small kindnesses that made the house feel lived in. And Ruby?
You wouldn't believe
Ruby
what
handled the
happened.
things no one else saw. She kept
Oh, wait.
records, managed the supplies,
Oh,
wrote to
go
contacts
on.
in nearby towns to ensure they had what they
That's
needed.
how I learned
She did what she'd
to
always
read.
done. She built infrastructure, made sure the foundation was solid, because Ruby understood something the others maybe didn't yet. This house wasn't just shelter. It was the beginning of something. And if more women came, if this gathering was real and intentional, they'd need more than hope.
Husband.
They'd need strategy. They'd need planning. They'd need someone who understood how to turn survival into permanence. Weeks passed. The house became home. Not in the soft way. Not
Do
in
you
the way
ever
of lace
regret what you
curtains and
left
flower
behind?
gardens, but in the
No.
way of 3 women who'd each been alone too long, finally finding a place where they didn't have to perform, didn't have to pretend, could just exist. They talked more now, shared stories, not the big ones yet, but small ones, memories of before, of who they'd been when the world still seemed like it might be kind. Ruby told them about learning to read by candlelight in the brothel, about a girl who'd taught her and died before she was 16. Magdalena talked about her mother, about faith that felt real before men made it a weapon. Sarah mentioned a husband once, just once, and they all understood not to push. Some stories needed time. Some wounds were still too fresh to touch.
No.
One night, as they sat around the fire, Sarah asked
I
Ruby a
understand.
question, asked if she regretted leaving her empire. Ruby thought about that, about the saloon, the money, the power, the men who'd feared her, and she realized the answer was no. She didn't regret it, because all of that had been survival. This was living. There was a difference, a crucial difference she'd never understood before. Survival was about building walls high enough to keep the world
I
out.
have read it thrice.
Living was about finding
is what it
people you could
says.
trust enough to let them in.
What does it say?
She didn't
We
say
need to
all of
leave.
that out loud, just said
We
no,
need to dance.
and Sarah nodded,
We need to organize.
like she
now.
understood exactly what Ruby meant,
Let's begin with prayer.
like she'd made the same
Together we
choice for
pray.
the same reasons.
Together we prepare.
Another letter
Agreed.
arrived, slipped under the door
Agreed.
while they slept. Sarah found it at
The
dawn,
way he holds his
brought it to the
cards.
table.
That's the
They
tell.
read it together.
Leverage
It
comes from
said,
patience,
"More
not
are
haste.
coming. The gathering
I
is not
understand.
complete. When 7 stand together, the purpose will be clear. Until then, prepare. Build trust. Because what comes next will test everything you've become." The letter was unsigned, no rose this time, just words that felt like both promise and warning. Ruby read it 3 times. Then she looked at Sarah and Magdalena, asked what they thought. Sarah said they should prepare. Magdalena said they should pray. Ruby said they should do both, and they all agreed. They spent the next month fortifying, not dramatically, not obviously, but in small strategic ways. Ruby taught them what she knew about leverage, about reading people, about seeing threats before they materialized. Sarah taught them about defense, about positions and sight lines and how to make a house into a fortress without it looking like one. Magdalena taught them patience, about waiting for the right moment, about faith that wasn't passive, but active, purposeful. And together, they built something that hadn't existed before. A foundation, not just of wood and stone, but of trust, of shared purpose, of understanding that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Ruby lay in bed one night thinking about the women who hadn't arrived yet. 4 more. 4 more women with their own stories, their own sins, their own reasons for being here. She wondered who they were, what they'd survived, how they'd become sharp enough to warrant an invitation to this place. And she wondered what would happen when they all finally stood together. 7 women who'd refused to break. 7 weapons forged in different fires. 7 survivors gathered for a purpose none of them understood yet. It should have terrified her, the uncertainty, the lack of control. But it didn't. Because for the first time in her life, Ruby Lane wasn't alone. And that was worth more than any empire. The moon moved across the window. The house settled into silence. And Ruby closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest. Really rest. The kind of rest that only comes when you finally stop running, when you finally stop building walls, when you finally let yourself believe that maybe, just maybe, you've found a place where you don't have to be the devil's rose anymore. Where you can just be Ruby. And that's enough. Tomorrow, more work, more preparation, more waiting for the others to arrive. But tonight, in this house with these women, Ruby Lane allowed herself something she'd denied herself for 15 years. Hope. Real hope. The dangerous kind. The kind that could get you killed. Or the kind that could save you. She'd find out which soon enough. Winter came early that year. Ruby woke one morning to find frost on the windows and her breath visible in the cold air. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Sarah already stoking the fire. They worked together in comfortable silence, adding wood, coaxing warmth back into the house. Magdalena appeared with coffee, her rosary beads wrapped around her wrist like always. The 3 of them stood by the fire, hands wrapped around warm cups, watching the sun rise over the frozen valley. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Some mornings were meant for quiet. The cold brought new challenges. Firewood needed constant attention. The well required breaking ice each morning. Supplies had to be carefully rationed because travel to the nearest town became harder with each snowfall. But Ruby had lived through hard winters before, had survived worse than cold, and here at least she wasn't facing it alone. Sarah proved invaluable, her knowledge of survival absolute and unquestionable. Magdalena turned their limited ingredients into meals that felt like comfort, and Ruby managed the numbers. Calculated how long their supplies would last, planned for contingencies, made sure they'd survive until spring. One particularly brutal night, as wind howled around the house and snow piled against the windows, they gathered close to the fire. Sarah told a story about her childhood in the north, about winters so cold the trees would crack like gunshots, about learning to survive in a land that killed the unprepared. Magdalena shared memories of her mission, of cold stone floors and colder silences, of prayers whispered in the dark. And Ruby, surprising herself, talked about the brothel, about winters when they couldn't afford enough coal, about girls who got sick and never recovered, about learning that survival wasn't pretty or noble. It was just what you did, one day at a time, one cold night at a time, until spring came. If it came. The isolation of winter brought them closer. There was nowhere to go. Nothing to do but survive and talk and exist together.
He died. It was my
Ruby
fault.
learned things she never would have otherwise. Learned that Sarah had once been married, that her husband had been killed by men who wanted his land, that she'd tracked each of them down and made sure they understood their mistake before they died. Learned that Magdalena had witnessed a massacre at her mission, that she'd hidden in a cellar while everyone she loved was murdered above her, that she'd emerged with her faith shattered but not destroyed, reformed into something harder, something that could hold
I
both
was only
forgiveness
14,
and fury.
sold like livestock.
In return,
and I'll tell you everything
Ruby
if
told
you
them
promise the
everything
same in return.
about being sold at
I have the
14,
secrets.
about learning to
Clayton Voss was
weaponize
weak,
information,
a poisoner.
about
But I
building
have
an
built
empire out
from
of
the
secrets and
lies told
survival,
over his empty
about
grave.
Clayton Voss
I
and the
took the
poison
strength
and the
to
funeral
survive.
where she'd cried beautiful
And in
lies,
doing so, I
about
lost
the
everything
loneliness
I
that
ever
came with
cared for.
power, about waking up one day and realizing she'd become exactly what she'd needed to become to survive, but had lost everything else in the process. Sarah and Magdalena listened without judgment, without pity, just listened. And when Ruby finished, Magdalena reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Sarah nodded once, and that was all. That was enough. Because they understood. They'd all made the same bargain. Safety for softness, survival for soul. And they'd all paid the price. As winter deepened, Ruby found herself thinking less about redemption, about the empire she'd abandoned, the saloon that ran without her, the men who'd forgotten her or feared her or both. None of it mattered anymore. It felt like a story about someone else. A character she'd played so long, she'd forgotten it was a performance. But here, in this house, with these women, Ruby didn't have to perform, didn't have to calculate every word, every gesture, every smile. She could just be. Messy, complicated, tired, real. And they didn't reject her for it. Didn't use
we
it
need to
against her.
consider all the risks.
Just accepted
I
it.
agree. Then
Accepted
let's
her.
move forward.
The way she was learning to accept them. One morning, Ruby woke to find another letter under the door. She brought it to the table where Sarah and Magdalena waited. The handwriting was the same, elegant, deliberate. It said, "Winter is a test. Those who survive the cold together will survive anything. 4 more are coming. When the snow melts and the roads open, they will find their way here. Prepare your hearts. Prepare your minds. The gathering is almost complete.
Anticipate the
And
next
when it
move.
is,
Observe
you
everything.
will understand why you were
Use
chosen,
what they give you. That is
why
leverage.
you were brought here,
Notice the angle here?
why
It's a weak
7
point.
matters."
Yes, I see it.
Yeah.
Ruby
be
read it
careful.
aloud twice,
And the door.
then they sat
we
in
enter
silence,
now.
each processing what it meant. 4 more women,
Patience. Watch
4 more
and
survivors.
wait. Waiting is a
the
weapon.
number 7.
Faith.
Sarah
Keep it
finally
close.
spoke,
It will carry you.
said they'd need more rooms ready, more supplies, more everything. Ruby agreed, started making lists in her head. Magdalena
alignment here
said
is
they'd
off.
need more than supplies.
It's not
They'd
sturdy
need
enough.
patience,
It's not sturdy
understanding.
Perhaps if
Because
we
bringing
reinforce
together
this
7
section.
women who'd all survived the unsurvivable wouldn't be easy, wouldn't be simple, would require grace none of them were sure they still possessed. They spent the rest of winter preparing. Ruby wrote to her contacts, arranged for supplies to be delivered when the roads cleared, used her connections to ensure they'd have what they needed without drawing attention to why. Sarah expanded the house, added shelves, fixed structural issues, made sure the building could hold more bodies more comfortably. Magdalena stockpiled food, preserved everything she could, planned meals that would stretch, that would feed 7 instead of 3, and together, they transformed the house from a refuge for 3 damaged women into something else, something bigger, a home, a fortress, a gathering place. They didn't know exactly what it would become, but they were building it anyway, brick by brick, day by day, with faith that whoever had sent those letters knew what they were doing. Spring came slowly. First the ice melted, then the snow receded. The valley turned green again. Birds returned. The world woke up, and with it, Ruby felt something shift, an anticipation, a certainty that change was coming, that the quiet months of winter had been preparation for something. She stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the awakening land.
You've arrived.
Sarah joined her,
Thank the
then
Lord.
Magdalena. The 3 of
Come
them
inside,
stood there in
Josephine.
comfortable silence.
Josephine.
3
Oh,
women
thank
who'd
goodness
survived
you're
winter,
here.
who'd survived worse, who were ready for whatever came next. Ruby thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, the Devil's Rose, the Empress of Redemption, powerful, feared, alone. That woman felt like a stranger now, a ghost, someone she'd needed to be but didn't need to be anymore. The first wildflowers appeared in late spring, small purple blooms that dotted the valley like promises. Magdalena picked some, put them in a jar on the table. Ruby looked at them and remembered the pressed rose from the letter, the symbol that had brought her here. She wondered if the others had received roses too, if that was the common thread, the signal, the invitation. She asked Sarah and Magdalena. Both nodded. Both had received letters with pressed roses. Both had kept them. Sarah's was tucked in a Bible she never read anymore but couldn't throw away. Magdalena's was pressed in a prayer book, and Ruby's was still between the pages of her account ledger. 3 roses, 3 women, 4 more coming. The pattern was clear even if the purpose wasn't. One afternoon in early summer, Ruby was working in the garden when she saw dust on the horizon. Someone coming. She stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, called to Sarah. By the time the rider came into view, all 3 of them were on the porch, waiting. The rider was a woman, alone, dust-covered and exhausted. She rode right up to the house, dismounted slowly, and looked at them with eyes that had seen too
Almost
much.
there. Precise.
Ruby recognized those eyes, recognized what they meant.
Yes.
This was
yes.
one of them,
Perfection.
one of the 4. The woman didn't speak right away, just stood there, breathing hard, looking at the house like she couldn't believe it was real. Finally, she said just 3 words. "I got lost." Sarah smiled, said, "We all did." Magdalena gestured toward the door,
Really, and that's the
said,
story.
"You're home now." And the woman,
Oh, I
this
love it.
stranger
It's
who
just so
wasn't really a
perfectly
stranger,
you.
started to cry. They brought her inside, gave her water, food,
Land of the
space to
West.
breathe. Her name was Josephine. She'd come from the East, had been a teacher once, a judge's daughter, had believed in law and order until the law became a weapon and order became oppression. She'd fought back, lost everything, spent months running, and then she'd received a letter with a pressed rose and coordinates to a house she'd never heard of. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go, because the letter promised something she'd stopped believing in, that she wasn't alone, that other women had survived too, that maybe somewhere there was a place where survival could turn into something more than just not dying. Ruby watched Josephine settle into the house, watched her slowly relax, slowly trust. It took days, weeks, but eventually Josephine stopped flinching at sudden noises, stopped sleeping with her hand on a weapon, stopped looking at the others like they might betray her, and Ruby understood, because she'd gone through the same process when she first arrived. Learning to trust after years of trusting no one. Learning to lower walls after building them so high nothing could get through. It wasn't easy, wasn't fast, but it was possible. The house proved it was possible. 4 of them now, 3 more coming. The gathering growing, the purpose still unclear. But Ruby didn't need clarity yet. She just needed this. These women, this place, this possibility that maybe the rest of her life could be different from everything that came before. Summer deepened, the valley bloomed, and Ruby Lane, who'd spent 15 years building an empire out of fear and information and control, found herself building something else, something she didn't have a name for yet, something that felt dangerous in a completely different way. Not dangerous like power, dangerous like hope, like trust, like believing that maybe she deserved more than just survival. Maybe they all did. She didn't know if the others felt the same way, didn't ask. But sometimes, sitting around the table after dinner, watching Sarah and Magdalena and Josephine talk and laugh and exist without armor, Ruby thought they must feel it too. This fragile, terrifying, beautiful thing they were building together. One night, unable to sleep, Ruby sat on the porch watching stars. She thought about the 3 women still coming, wondered who they were, what they'd survived, how they'd broken and reformed. She thought about what it would mean when all 7 finally stood together in this house. 7 women the world had tried to destroy. 7 survivors who'd refused to stay broken. 7 weapons forged in different fires but tempered by the same impossible choice. Survive or die. They'd chosen survival. And somehow, impossibly, their survival had led them here. To each other. To this house. To whatever came next. Ruby didn't know what that was. But for the first time in her life, she was okay with not knowing, because she trusted the process, trusted the other women, Trusted that whoever had sent those letters knew what they were doing. Trusted that when the time came, when all 7 stood together, the purpose would become clear. Until then, she'd wait. She'd prepare. She'd build. And she'd be ready. The night was quiet except for wind in the cottonwoods. Ruby pulled her shawl tighter against the chill, smiled at nothing, at everything, at the impossible fact that she was here, that she'd walked away from everything she'd built to find something better, something real. The Devil's Rose was dead. Ruby Lane was alive. And that made all the difference. She stood, walked inside, closed the door gently, and went to bed knowing that tomorrow would bring more work, more waiting, more preparation, but also more of this, more of them, more of the life she was building with women who understood what it cost to survive, women who'd paid the same price, women who were becoming something more than just survivors. They were becoming sisters, becoming family, becoming the thing the West had never seen before. 7 women who refused to break. And when they finally stood together, Ruby suspected the whole territory would learn what she already knew. You don't hunt what's learned to hunt back. You run, and you pray you're fast enough. But by then, it would be too late.